Foremost, thank you all for joining us. So we want to reiterate some of the points that we had during our last week's discussion. And the purpose of today's talk is threefold. We will be providing you with a synopsis of the HSI initiatives as they've developed through the course of the past couple of years at UCSC. Second, we will present a framework from which our HSI and evaluation unit uses to guide inquiry and evaluation projects. And the two components are going to help us nest the preliminary findings as they relate to the HSI-funded program W.O.R.D. And lastly, we will close with implications that this work has for UCSC as a whole. My colleague, Andrea Vazquez, will be joining us, and she will be talking about the preliminary findings for the W.O.R.D program. But above all, I think this is a great opportunity to invite the UCSC campus community to engage critically with the content that we're presenting and to challenge ourselves to think about what it truly means to serve students at UCSC. Okay, so first, we'd like to begin by turning your attention to the mission of the Division of Student Success, which is where the HSI initiatives are housed. The mission of the Division of Student Success at UCSC reads as follows: with a commitment to promoting equity, inclusion, and a sense of well-being for all of our students, our mission is to support the development of the whole student using research-based, innovative best practices that enable UC Santa Cruz students to thrive academically, professionally, and personally. The Division of Student Success also acknowledges that there exists an institutional responsibility to serve students by stating that student success is not the sole responsibility of the student, but requires alignment with campus policies, processes, and ensuring a positive climate with adequate resources available to our students, particularly those of highest risk. Efforts must occur at all levels in the university, be coordinated and mutually reinforcing. Okay, so now let's go ahead and turn to the next slide. And in 2012, UCSC reached the Hispanic-Serving Institution threshold of having reached 25% of its undergraduate student population who self-identify as Hispanic Latinx students. Since then, the U.S. Department of Education designated UC Santa Cruz as an eligible institution under Title III and Title V programs, officially recognizing our campus as a Hispanic-serving institution and giving UC Santa Cruz the opportunity to apply for federal grants. And then on May 5th of 2012, Vice Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Education, Richard Huey, called together a team that would focus on, first, initiatives and ideas to increase our visibility, value, and effectiveness for students for underrepresented groups. 2, review of best practices and their feasibility for expansion or adaptation at UCSC or to UCSC. 3, articulation of means and methods for assessing and improving program and campus accomplishments related to underrepresented groups. And 4, determine opportunities for fundraising related to HSI status, potentially including grant proposals. From this memorandum, the following guiding question was developed: what accelerates and impedes the academic achievement or success and or social and emotional well-being of Latinx or Hispanic students at UC Santa Cruz? In 2013, a year after the HSI task force was formed, I had accepted an invitation from Dr. Eduardo Mosqueda in the Department of Education to pursue graduate studies under his mentorship. And at this time, Pablo Rigarin was searching for someone to help lead the investigation that would help identify equity gaps at UC Santa Cruz. So with an interest in higher education and applied statistics and data, and with the guidance of Professor Mosqueda and Pablo Rigarin, I submitted an application for the Chancellor's Graduate Internship, which provided support to fund my graduate studies and the investigation leading to the identification of equity gaps at UC Santa Cruz. So to encapsulate a very long story, we were able to develop the infrastructure and apply the appropriate methodologies that helped us to identify equity issues at UC Santa Cruz. From this early investigation, we were able to gather the data that showed that Hispanic Latinx students were disproportionately underperforming in key gateway courses like math, and were struggling to meet the entry-level writing requirements relative to their counterparts. And I would really like to stress the importance of access to data for the identification of equity issues that resulted in the successful application of our first HSI grant, which is MAPA. Since May 5th of 2012, when the memorandum from Richard Huey was released, UC Santa Cruz has since successfully received 3 HSI grants, totaling $9.6 million, and a roadmap was developed in collaboration with academic departments across the UCSC campus, outlining specific commitments and expectations. The first grant, the Maximizing Achievement Through Preparedness and Advising, MAPA, a Title V project, really presented a significant step in the evolution of UC Santa Cruz as a Hispanic-Serving Institution. And the MAPA project was designed to reduce disparities by implementing research-based, data-driven, interwoven activities that enabled UC Santa Cruz to put into place the systematic support that students needed to successfully navigate the university experience. Another grant that we've received is the Cultivamos Excelencia grant. And the primary goal of Cultivamos Excelencia is to motivate and retain Hispanic and other high-need students to complete a degree at a research university. And in September of 2016, UC Santa Cruz received a third U.S. Department of Education grant of $5.9 million, focusing on reducing attrition rates for low-income and Hispanic Latinx students in STEM-based degrees, science, technology, engineering, and math. So from the inquiry, in this investigation, there were some clusters and themes that developed. So the first theme that developed was the redesigning of gateway courses at UC Santa Cruz, developing reading and college writing institutes, strengthening a sense of belongingness for students on the campus, deepening academic coaching and advising, attending to the needs of the transfer student community, and providing faculty and professional development. Each component is designed to intervene early and make decisive moves about where to focus our energies on and to help improve retention and graduation rates. So this all with the intention of strengthening UCSC's ability to provide all the services for the students to thrive on the campus academically. So 3 years after the first HSI grant, we have stopped to think about what we've done in the past couple of years and have taken the opportunity to reflect and ask ourselves what have been the effects of these interventions, if any, on student achievement. So for this reason, we are launching our equity talks in efforts to interrogate this work in collaboration with the campus community. So now that you have a general sense and a general background of how the HSI initiatives developed at UC Santa Cruz, let's now turn to the framework that our HSI and Data Evaluation Unit uses to guide the inquiry process. So it's important to have a working definition of equity. After all, we are titling our talks Equity Talks. So let's define equity. So what is equity? So according to Alicia Dowd and Estela Ben-Simon, I quote from their recent publication, "Equity means different things to different people. In some ways, the abstractness and pliability of the term equity is advantageous, and the expression equity is open to interpretation, and people have an intuitive sense that when we are speaking about equity, we are speaking about fairness. Equity is a standard for judging whether a state of affairs is just or unjust. However, many colleges and universities practitioners quickly interpret equity as referring to equality of opportunity, which is only one aspect of most formal definitions of equity. And they add that this narrowing of the meaning of the term equity shuts out more nuanced principles that we believe should also be guiding accountability and policy." Dowd and Ben-Simon also add that a major impediment to meaningful reform of educational policies and practices that produce racial inequalities is the lack of a shared understanding about what equity means. So with the guidance of W.O.R.D and Ben-Simon, and with the guidance of some other authors in higher education and the educational field in general, we have our definition of, we've developed our own working definition of equity as it relates to the UCSC context. We will be sending via email some attachments about the HSI Data and Evaluation Unit mission and vision statement that you all can take a look at to see a little bit about what we do and how we work. But we've turned to the work of these leading scholars to help us build a working definition that fits our context, that fits our environment. We are a UC campus, we are a public university, and we are also a research university. So we defined equity in the following way. We define it as the inability to predict student achievement and participation based solely upon characteristics such as race, class, ethnicity, gender, beliefs, and proficiency in the dominant language. So when we can no longer detect or predict student outcomes such as GPA, graduation, retention based solely on these markers, then we will have achieved some sort of parity. And ultimately, equity in education is not just an abstract goal, but an ongoing process, a process that consciously entails the empowerment of practitioners to be agents of change. So along these lines, the empowerment of practitioners is really a good way to create strategies in which to address equity issues at UC Santa Cruz. And like W.O.R.D and Ben-Simon, we believe that when the inquiry process in investigating gaps and racial disparities in performance, that when this process is done at high quality, practitioners can gain the expertise to support their capacity to act as advocates and develop a commitment to inquiry as a tool. So for the past 3 years, we have refined our inquiry process by turning to the work of W.O.R.D and Ben-Simon, who offer a framework that magnifies ways that institutions of higher education adapt or fail to adapt to changing student demographics. We also question the ways knowledge and practice are constructed, evaluated, and used. So through this inquiry process, which is fueled by data, practitioners engage in reflection of practices, experimentation, and evaluation. W.O.R.D and Ben-Simon emphasize that part of the work of practitioners is to individually and collectively question, deconstruct, and reconstruct practices to address equity issues at the university. Our data and evaluation unit is intentional for assisting practitioners through this process, and we help practitioners evaluate interventions, and we turn to ways of developing adaptive expertise to promote institutional change, leading to favorable student outcomes. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to one example, which is the HSI MAPA-funded program called W.O.R.D, that illustrates how we've enacted the practitioner inquiry as drivers of change cycle and how we seek to empower our practitioners. So just briefly, the W.O.R.D program emerged from the identification of data which suggested that there was a rising number of students who failed the entry-level writing requirements at UC Santa Cruz. And aligned with W.O.R.D and Ben-Simon's concept of the equity scorecard, our HSI data and evaluation team, in collaboration with practitioners and Professor Catherine Cooper, generated a logic model for the program that identified the needs, activities, outputs, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, and implications by laying the groundwork, defining the problem, assessing interventions, implementing solutions, and now evaluating the results. The data used in this process, there was data used in this process in the early stages to identify the equity issues, and we've really leveraged a lot from Sharis Hirsan in her ability to help us contextualize the data. We acknowledge that numerical data to identify equity issues exist within the UCSC databases, However, with the institutional knowledge of Sharis, her son, the data would remain inanimate, and data alone is not self-acting. So for this, we have relied heavily on the contextualization of data and policies that have occurred at the university to help us make sense about how to best develop an intervention or a program. All right, so now W.O.R.D. W.O.R.D stands for Writing Originating from Reading and Dialogue, which is a summer program led by Professor Juan Poblete that encompasses regional workshops for students who will begin their undergraduate studies at UC Santa Cruz in the fall. The program consists of 3 weeks of in-class workshops in August, each session lasting about 3 hours, followed by 2 weeks of online instruction. W.O.R.D has a literacy and critical consciousness theme that is made relevant at every class session. And texts from various genres and disciplines are covered during the program, along with reading strategies and tools, including discussions and written reflections on reading and personal experiences. The data used in the initial stages of the identification of equity issues was important, but in addition to that, data has also been used routinely to inform decisions about outreach efforts to students. I won't go into great detail about the specifics of how and when outreach happens in this presentation. However, I do want to point out that decisions to outreach to students are made by the HSI W.O.R.D committee in collaboration with the data and evaluation team. And we believe, and we really think about the issues of proximity to the program sites, what criteria to use for our outreach, such as race, scores on examinations, such as the analytical writing placement examination, and being very cognizant of when the scores are populated in the databases and so on. It's worth noting that the outreach logic and timeline have been refined through formative evaluation of the W.O.R.D program over the past 3 years. And because income has been identified as a critical predictor of achievement in education, we count on our collaborative relationship with the Financial Aid Office, who helps us identify students who have a moderate to high financial need. All right, so it is important to acknowledge that our outreach efforts are people-centered, and this involves, making phone calls to students, texting, sending emails, and outreaching to the students who we feel would most benefit from the program. And the outreach and communication with students is very critical for the success of the W.O.R.D program overall. In 2016, by 2016, we had served 48 students across the state in different locations. In the summer of 2017, we had served an additional 80, and by summer of 2018, we had served an additional 94 students, totaling about 222 students over the past 3 years. The location sites are decided upon by the committee based on clusters of locations in which students who have enrolled to UCSC reside, and where we believe we will be getting a larger population of students who can benefit from the programs. Generally, here are the demographic characteristics of the students who have gone through the 3 cycles of the W.O.R.D program. Just really briefly, I won't go into great detail about these demographics, but it gives you a general sense of who the students were. So now let's turn to, and I have also provided you with the average GPA of the students. It's important to note here that these students are coming with high GPAs from their high school. They're top of their classes at their high schools, and I think that that's a very critical feature and important to note. That these students are really are doing very well when they're at the high school level. So now let's go ahead and turn to one of the evaluation angles that has been of importance to our team, and that is the sense of belongingness angle. And we want to know whether W.O.R.D students' sense of belongingness has had an effect, if any, in their experiences in transition from the summer program to UC Santa Cruz. Our data and evaluation team purposefully turns to existing bodies of literature to guide various evaluation projects for all HSI initiatives. And the focus of W.O.R.D students' sense of belongingness has pushed us to familiarize ourselves with the existing literature to help us make more informed decisions. One of the challenges for empirically studying sense of belongingness is that it's conceptualized, defined, and operationalized differently by different researchers. And definitions of belongingness are nearly as numerous as the researchers who have considered using this construct in the research. I mean, the literature goes way back. I mean, we have a citation here from 1966, which says that sense of belongingness is a recognition and acceptance by others. Other colleagues over the years, like Haggerty and colleagues, have said that belongingness is, from a psychological perspective, is an internal affective and evaluative feeling or perception. One of the seminal papers on sense of belongingness by Baumeister and Leary say that sense of belongingness is a person's belief that others care about their well-being. And these perspectives suggest that the quality and investment of social relationships matter. Other colleagues, like Lee and Robbins in 1995, proposed that belongingness is composed of three important dimensions, such as companionship, affiliation, and connectedness. And Eccles and Roser in 2009 cited the stage environment fit theory, which suggests that a possible reason for the drop in school belongingness among students may be due to a mismatch between the educational environment and the developmental needs of students. However, I think it's important to identify some folks who can allow us to think about this work. My colleague Andrea Vazquez will provide more recent citations of folks who have been thinking about these issues, but we turn more or less to the work of Haggerty and colleagues, who describe two concepts that they believe to be central for belongingness, which is valued involvement, such as the experience of feeling valued and needed or accepted by others, and fit, referring to the perception that a person's characteristics complements a system or environment. And then we also turn to the definition of Goodenow, who states that belongingness is the extent to which students personally feel accepted, respected, included, and supported by others in the educational or school environment. Okay, so prior research has already pointed out the reciprocal relationship between belongingness in educational settings and achievement. And having a high degree of educational sense of belongingness has consistently been regarded as an important predictor of adaptive social functioning and optimal learning. And researchers have therefore examined how sense of belongingness could be best conceptualized, applied, measured in relationship to educational outcomes. So taken together, sense of belongingness has been shown to be a critical factor that helps us understand engagement and academic outcomes in education. Other researchers have conceptually understood sense of belongingness as an experience that is directly tied to the environment where individuals or students seek to connote their memberships. However, in this case, there's an added layer of complexity here, because now we're trying to understand how the program like W.O.R.D is having some sort of effect on students' sense of belongingness as they transition to the university context. So now what I am going to do is I am going to pass it over to my colleague Andrea Vazquez, who is going to be presenting on the preliminary findings of some of the qualitative work on the W.O.R.D students to help us give us some more insight about what's happening with these students' transitions as they come to UC Santa Cruz.
Okay, so perhaps a good place to start is to think a little bit about how we were approaching this question of sense of belonging. The first things that we did was create a design that included a pre-survey that was administered electronically the week before students started the W.O.R.D program. So this was at the point where they had already graduated high school and were getting ready to start W.O.R.D. We also administered a post-survey electronically the last week of the program. So this was done at the point where they were getting ready to wrap up the program and start transitioning to W.O.R.D. So they were not at UCSC yet. They were transitioning from W.O.R.D into UCSC. Once they got to UCSC, week 2, so as soon as they got here, we ran a focus group with 9 students. And these students were incentivized with a scholarship. And that scholarship was meant to alleviate or buffer a little bit of the self-selection process. And for future steps, we wanted to do a focus group, or we want to do a focus group in winter and spring quarter with the same 9 students. And so the idea is that throughout this first year, we're going to follow them at each quarter to really gauge the effect of W.O.R.D. We also are bringing in a little bit of the literature from cultural belonging. So thinking with Gibson, Levinson, and Abu-Ahash. And so the reason for this is because W.O.R.D is being positioned in their timeline to UCSC right before UCSC. And so we wanted to see if, as far as belonging, this program was going to mediate a little bit of that cultural transition. And so Gibson's framework has been extremely beneficial in our making sense of their experiences, but we're also bringing in Levinson and Abu-Ahash because they think they extend Gibson's work and start thinking about structures. So the role of institutions of higher learning as power structures. Another thing that I wanted to point to you was academic language. So we started using academic language as a way to start getting the students to think about their transition. So since W.O.R.D has to do with reading and writing, we really wanted them to start thinking about a cultural transition where they were acquiring the skills and the fluency of being able to speak within the university, but also write. I do want to say that Jim Cummings' work is controversial, especially in the field of education, and it's because it creates a binary between academic language and your home language, and it doesn't really, that framework allows you to think about different ways of learning. But the reason why we kept it was because, unfortunately, at the university, the only way that you're assessed is through your fluency in your academic language. Okay, so what we've done is something that we're calling an acculturation schema. So acculturation simply means the process by which culture is changed or adapted to when 2 individuals from 2 different cultures come into contact. This is important for us because it is a reciprocal relationship between individuals. So it's not that one individual is adapting or changing, but together, how they are working in relationship to each other. We're using this framework to make sense not of individuals, but of the students and the institution. So what are the tools and the skills and practices that students are developing as they're transitioning into the university? But also this framework provides us some insight into the ways in which the university can also transform to create relationships with the students. And then schema is just a reference to the way that we're thinking about this. So a map. And as you can see, it starts from high school into their experience at W.O.R.D. And then as they transition to UCSC, and then what we're going to look at is the experiences they're having academically, the experiences that they're having socially, and then ultimately how they interact with the university, and it's university with a capital U. So also thinking about policy and the university as an institution, and how that interaction then informs the way they're conceptualizing their belonging here at UCSC. So we're going to start here at the beginning. So high school to W.O.R.D and UCSC. And what I'm going to do from now on is present with you some quotes. But first, we're going to look at the post-survey, because the post-survey gives us some insight into this phase of the transition. So we learned from the post-survey that W.O.R.D gives students strategies to read. And so they speak a lot about their metacognitive skills and their abilities to annotate. So an increase in those types of skills. We also learned that critical and social justice oriented texts, most notably the book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, that these texts are speaking to their experiences as minority students, but that also these texts are giving them a space and a way for them to start positioning themselves as readers. So an increase in interest to reading, but also this relationship that they are creating to the text itself. So learning about themselves and their weaknesses when they come to reading. They're also engaging in practices of social development. So creating friendships, increasing their confidence to participate in discussion-based classes with students. And that's mostly because they're doing that with students who have similar experiences. So they are developing socially and intellectually with students who are very much like themselves. So it is a very safe space for them to engage in discussion-based classes. And we're going to see the effect of that when they come here. So just as a reminder that this phase and this data is coming from their time at W.O.R.D, so right before attending UCSC. And so now let's pretend like they're coming into UCSC, and we're going to look at what happens academically and then what happens socially. So academically first. And here are some quotes. One thing that I do want to mention about the quotes is that these quotes that we're presenting to you are raw quotes, meaning that we have not cleaned them up for vocabulary and grammar relationships. So some of the grammar that you might see might be a little bit off, and we also did not change any of the words that they use. So there's some that have a little bit of profanity, but the reason why we wanted to do this is so that you all could really get a sense for the way that these students are experiencing the university and their transition. So first quote I want to share with you, and this is coming from the focus groups, and it is a question that I asked them to reflect on their experiences within the classroom right now, their first opinions and thoughts. And so we have a student that's saying that in high school, I had teachers that were talking and my mind was blown, but her, and this is a reference to her core instructor, it's like she's even higher because she'll be talking and I'm waiting for her to get to the point and she sidetracks, and so she's never getting anywhere. Like it's all these run-on sentences and she doesn't finish, and when I take notes there's gaps and I don't know if I should complete them because I don't understand what's going on, right? And so the what I want y'all to keep in mind is that having seen the data that was presented to make sense of their experiences right before coming into UCSC, just right out of W.O.R.D, right before UCSC, that their self-efficacy is pretty high and that they're feeling really confident. But once they get to UCSC, things start changing, right? So they start having a difficulty following verbal instructions rather than written instructions. Another quote, I feel like academic-wise, I don't say anything because I'm so scared to speak, to be judged of how I speak. The vocabulary, how it's not up to standard. And then I ask a question to the group. Do any of y'all feel that same way? And we have another student that is following up and saying that, yeah, I got her. I feel that sometimes the people in my class is so superior. The vocabulary is so heavy that if I speak up, it doesn't sound as smart, even though it's the same thoughts. It just doesn't sound as smart. It's that barrier, right? So what we're seeing here, it's another layer of complexity. So whereas before they were expressing that they were feeling comfortable with their friendships, now we're starting to see that they're starting to make some sort of differentiation between themselves and their other peers, something that they hadn't done in W.O.R.D. And it's mostly through the way that they're talking. So they don't necessarily think that they are quote unquote dumber. They just know that they sound different. Not only in the way that they speak, right? So, but also in the ways that they put their thoughts together. So next slide. For me, like a few times, I have been shut down by my classmates when we are analyzing something and they something like, I'm like, okay, And so I say something too, and they're like, no, because this and that. And then they say something else, and they're like, no. And so then I'm like, what's the point? My views aren't correct. So another thing that starts happening within the first 2 weeks is that they also start realizing that their peer experiences from W.O.R.D that they had of feeling in solidarity might not be necessarily the same things that they experience once they come here. And so to recap, academically, we start seeing that even though at W.O.R.D they have expressed that W.O.R.D has given them the tools to annotate, that there is a difference between annotating from the text and annotating from verbal lectures. And then we also start seeing that they start making comparisons with their peers based on their academic language that informs them of their positions within the classroom. And now socially, let's see what happens once they get here. I think W.O.R.D, academically, it helped me transition, but more than academically, it was helpful transition socially, and I was able to make friends there and meet people with similar academic goals. And those people who I met at W.O.R.D will text me and ask me if I had applied to this program and that other program, and it was kind of comforting knowing that when I got here, I wouldn't be a total loner from the beginning, and most of them are Hispanic, so I felt like I could bond culturally. There is something nice about having friends who share something cultural. So one of the things that we're learning is that W.O.R.D for a lot of these students gave them social skills. So the ability to not only make friends, but that within their friends group, they start sharing resources, academic resources. And obviously, there's something to be said about this cultural bond, right? All right, so this is another conversation. And I asked the group a straightforward belonging question, where if you had to pinpoint space on campus or a class where you were like, these are my people, where would that be? And so we have a student saying, our path, I love our path, I love the people from our path, right? And so I, not knowing what our path is, say, what is that? And so this is the Stevenson house that is painted with Rosa Parks, and the student says that she thinks that she probably knows the whole entire building. And this idea of belonging at the colleges was a profound one that was also experienced by another student from Oaks, who says that I feel most comfortable at my own college, at Oaks. When I came here, I thought I was going to have culture shock, white people like everywhere, but then at Oaks, it's like the most diverse place, right? And so socially, we see that these students have built social networks that result from their participation in W.O.R.D, right? But that in those 2 weeks of them being here at UCSC, their sense of belonging is the strongest at their colleges, in their houses. And perhaps because these students are of color, it makes sense that they might be at the most diverse colleges and that plays a significant role for them. What I'm going to show you next, it's a few more quotes, because where it gets really interesting is when we start seeing how these two aspects of their lives start interacting. So when I came to orientation, I was like, damn, for me, I can only speak from my experience. In high school, I was involved and did programs and go to different campuses to meet people and knew how this diversity thing was going to be, that I'm a minority type of thing. But then I came here and it's like, this is not just a 1 week program. It's like for the rest of my 4 years. And it hit me and I was like, fuck, like, damn, I'm really here. And that's a good thing. But it's kind of like the question, I belong here. And now these few weeks, I'm joining groups and it's kind of finding myself, and I do belong here. I'm going to be here. I'm going to make the changes. So we know from the W.O.R.D students that as soon as they come to orientation, as soon as they set foot on campus, they know that there is something slightly different. One of the things that I do want to flag for all of you that work in student success or are working in spaces with first-gen students or students of color, that this rhetoric of diversity can at times, as we can see from this quote, I think it gives us some insight into what it does for some students. So even though the university might use it as a way of saying we welcome you, that some students are also seeing this as a way of being pointed out, right? That they know that they are a minority because of this whole diversity rhetoric. So something to think about and something that we're going to continue to look at. But I also want to say that even though this student is giving us some insight into her or their struggles, that there is an agency and a resiliency in this notion of that I do belong here, that I am finding my social networks to make that change, right? And so let's go on to the next one. So yeah, obviously this place has more white people than Hispanic and Latinx people. And yeah, it's scary. But coming here, I feel so proud of myself because we are here representing us and our families and the countries we come from. And being here, it's like, wow. And it makes me feel good, and I'm representing where I come from. So another thing that we know is that these students are very, very proud of their heritage and that of their experiences and their struggles, and that this for them is not something that they're willing to negotiate. This is also going to come important a little bit later on after we finish seeing these slides. So W.O.R.D helped me understand more about myself. I learned that it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not be at the same vocabulary level that someone else has, because we are all here learning. I feel like W.O.R.D made me feel more comfortable. In the classroom that we were in, I was really comfortable. We made so many friends and we were all bouncing ideas off each other, and so it helped me to be more comfortable. And it's okay that I don't know everything because I am here to learn. It definitely gave me that push, right? So what we see here, it's again this rhetoric, or this idea, not rhetoric, an idea that these students, that these friendships, right, and this space that was created in W.O.R.D allowed them to build a confidence, a self-efficacy for themselves, right? And that when they come to UCSC, that idea, that confidence that was built from being with each other in the classroom follows them, right? But it's in the next slide, and the next quote is going to show you why this is specifically important for these students, right? Here we go. I don't feel like I have to be part of it, and this is in reference to UCSC culture, in order to move on and go through school. You get me? When you say culture, I imagine the classroom culture or walking around. I feel like I don't have to feel a part of talking like that culture in order to be part of the school. I don't feel like excluded from it, but I also don't feel like I belong in it. And I am kind of in a limbo. I have a friend, he is a philosophy major, and sometimes he says these words and I'm like, he definitely just made that up. There's no way that's a real word. I actually love it, and I love the feeling of being friends with someone who knows all of this. If I ask him to define the word, he doesn't make me feel stupid or like he is in another level, even though he kind of is. He will just explain it to me, and he will carry on and keep having our conversations. I have met a lot of people like that, and I guess it's motivation. I really like it. I'm intrigued by it and drawn to it. And I want to keep learning, and I want to get to the point where I am that one person explaining words to someone else. And so I know this is a very lengthy quote, but the reason why it's important for us to show it to you, it's because there's a lot of layers of complexity to this. One, the way they think of belonging, what we're learning is that perhaps it might be very different than the way that UCSC conceptualized belonging, right? And that they don't necessarily think that feeling like they are part of the culture is going to inhibit their process, right? That they have that agency, that they know they're going to succeed. We also know that these students then start building also networks with other students, right? So here we see her, these students saying that he will just explain it to me, right? And that she enjoys learning from that student. And that gives her motivation to possibly be that one person that becomes like him. And so our hint is that since all these students are talking about those experiences that they're having with each other, that also gives them the skills to start building these social experiences or networks and relationships with students once they get here to the university. And so we're calling this, or we're just taking the framework again from Greta Gibson, who calls this as additive acculturation. So combined these last slides of being extremely proud of who you are, right? Of not giving up even though once you get to the university you feel like you're othered. Of trying to make sense of what is your position and how you're negotiating your belonging, right? That being in limbo. That these students are not necessarily thinking about what needs to change about them, but instead are thinking about what needs to be added to their way of being in the university, and that they're using their social networks to do that they're using their peers, and that they're using those friendships, and that being in W.O.R.D with students that have shared that same experiences has increased their confidence. Now, that's important because, as you could tell, this this inclination to go to your peers, to remember that you have the potential to succeed, to find that motivation might be, at least within these 2 weeks, acting as an academic experience buffer, right? So we heard them talk about how they felt academically, that they were having a hard time following their teacher, that they were not necessarily having positive relationships with the peers in their classrooms, right? But outside, we see that they do, right? And so this right here, this reminder of their motivation and high self-efficacy might be acting as a buffer. And this is good, right? That they're still very much thinking through the ways in which they can grow. But knowing the literature in higher education, and knowing that as students progress to university, their sense of belonging decreases, right? A quick report that can be looked up online that's very specific to UCSC is IRAPS has the report on who leaves UCSC, and that report does a good job of outlining when within the journey at UCSC students decide to not come back, and it's between their second year into their third year, right? So we have a lot of data that shows that students tend to decrease their sense of belonging for whatever reason. But this is not necessarily what this data is showing, right? This data is showing that students are trying to figure it out, but that at this moment, when they come here, they're very much motivated, right? And so what this tells us is that this agency, this need and want, and this idea that they themselves can do it can become positive and maintain an agency type of relationship to the university, or that it could become potentially negative depending on what types of relationships they continue to have with their peers, but also with the university, right? And so what policies and what programming the university does that could mediate the way that these students move through the university.
Okay, so given the preliminary findings that Andrea has on W.O.R.D students, let's go ahead and revisit the mission statement of the Division of Student Success, which is with a commitment to promoting equity, inclusion, and a sense of well-being for all of our students. The mission of the Division of Student Success is to support the development of the whole student using research-based, innovative best practices that enable UC Santa Cruz students to thrive academically, personally, and professionally. And then also as a reminder, the Division of Student Success states that student success is not the sole responsibility of the student, but requires alignment with campus policies, processes, and ensuring a positive climate with adequate resources available to our students, particularly those at highest risk. And efforts must occur at all levels in the university, be coordinated and mutually reinforcing. So we have this data that shows that students are coming into the university with a higher sense of belongingness, and then we want to contextualize this information from a recent call from Vice Provost of the Division of Student Success, Dr. Jay Paget, who called in a success staff engagement meeting on September 17th to strategize ways that we could improve retention rates at the campus, improve climate sense of belongingness, and improve learning in key courses. So we want to tie all of this together and think about the implications that this work has for the campus as a whole. And in order to do that, we need to parcel out some of the things that we do know in terms of the programming of W.O.R.D, and then the implications that that may have on policy. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Andrea to go through the major takeaways of the programming as we've heard. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can start pushing more towards the policy arena of things so that we can create the infrastructure to support these students.
Right. And so I think one of the thing that these quotes do the best is really kind of lay out a ground of how diverse these first experiences for these students can be, right? So even though we see that these students are feeling a little bit out of sync, out of place, that they are extremely resilient, and that at least within the 2 weeks, they're finding ways to keep in touch with each other and use each other to make it through. And so when we talk about programming, one of the things that we have been thinking about as a data team is, what do we intend the program to do? Does the program match with the needs of our students? And this is just coming out of us thinking through the way in which students might potentially be thinking about belonging slightly differently than what we as practitioners or researchers may think of that to be. How do we know what the needs of students are at a larger scale beyond W.O.R.D? So W.O.R.D, it's a small program. It's also with first-year freshmen, no transfer students. And so when we're thinking about programming, it might be useful to think about, is this program intended for first-year students, or is this intended for second and third-year students who might have different experiences? How are we as representatives of UCSC thinking about building positive relationships with our students? And what are the avenues through what we're doing that? And so as we're thinking about programming and the intention of our programming, is the purpose of this programming for students to get to know each other, or is it for us to come out and build relationships for them? And then how do we facilitate that happening? Are we training practitioners to foster culturally responsive relationships? Another thing to think about. And what can we learn from the HSI MCA? So
the multicultural conference. So in our future equity talks, right, we will be talking about some of the implications of the multicultural conference that was intended to give professional development through culturally responsive ways for advisors to interact with students on the campus, and that's to come in the future.
Right, and so when we're thinking about programming, I think one of the biggest takeaways from what we're learning with W.O.R.D is that these students are finding ways to make it through, right? That even when they say, I don't think I need to be part of the culture, it's more of them acknowledging that the university was not constructed for people who have had their experiences in mind, that this space wasn't built for folks that may come from low economic status, who might be first generation, right? And we know this from history, right? Like we know this from just looking at the history of higher ed. And so when we're thinking about programming, how do we maintain this positive relationship to the university? And that's pretty much an entry point that as a data team for HSI, we have been thinking through.
Yeah, so in addition to what Andrea has stated, I think that the work that is being done with the W.O.R.D students at the time is giving us insight into their experiences on the campus. So if we do know that students are experiencing sense of belongingness at their colleges, this may present an opportunity to really try to find ways to optimize that experience. So in closing, we want to now turn more to the policy aspect of this work. And to sustain students' views that they're here to grow and learn, we as representatives of the university need to make structural and sustained changes that support this mindset. It's ultimately our responsibility to students to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support them. So for example, some of the infrastructure may include revisiting major requirements, class sequences, inculcating culturally responsive pedagogical practices into our curriculum, promoting active learning practices, looking at alternative grading methods, culturally responsive training at the broader campus level for advisors, as we'll be talking about in the multicultural conference data presentation that we'll be giving. But ultimately, we wanted to communicate to students through the infrastructure of this university that we're authentically caring about them and not superficially caring about them. And this can mean a lot of different things. But again, we really invite the campus community to become a partner with our HSI initiatives and to help us really think critically through this work, especially as Andrea follows these students throughout the year. We'll be gaining more and more insight about their changes and their development. So there's very exciting new data that will be coming out soon. We'd like to extend this invitation to have all of you join us at our future equity talks and to join the conversation. Okay, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.